Welcome back. We have a great episode for you this week. Jeb and I are joined by Ed Pinto of the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank established in 1938. The American Enterprise Housing Center was co-founded by Ed in 2013 to track the housing market and government policies to ensure we never see a repeat of the great financial crisis again. In this conversation, we cover a lot of ground, including how exclusionary zoning and NIMBYism have not only contributed to the high cost of housing, but also economic segregation. We discuss why government solutions often fail to address the housing and affordability crisis, and in fact often have unintended consequences that make the situation even worse. Ed accurately points out why the federal government should focus on adding supply rather than increasing demand, as most policy initiatives dictate. Ed walks us through successful housing initiatives in Houston and Philadelphia that demonstrate the effectiveness of light touch density in rapidly increasing housing supply and affordability. We go over defined reform principles that will address the challenges faced by first-time homebuyers and why they are so important for long-term solutions. It's a great conversation. I think you'll find a lot of insight if you are in the market and interested in buying a home.
The American Enterprise Institute Housing Center, American Enterprise Institute's a think tank established in 1938. I call it a market-oriented think tank. Enterprise is our middle name. Government is not. And so we focus on how enterprise in the United States creates an abundance of everything for the citizens of the United States. The American Enterprise Housing Center I co-founded in 2013, and the purpose when I set it up was to track the housing market in the United States to help assure that we didn't have another event like the one that led up to the great financial crisis, when loose lending spread throughout the United States, led by the federal government's efforts, and that eventually just about brought down the world's economies and caused millions and millions of foreclosures and house price crashes and everything else in the United States. So we wanted to start tracking the housing market. We've been doing that for coming up on 11 years now. We've expanded our work substantially. We've created a data set that we consider to be the largest and most in-depth one in the country. But we've now expanded to a focus on how to deal with the affordability issues that we face increasingly as a country. And the conclusion we've reached, along with many others, is we need more housing supply. It is as simple as that.
How can we improve that? I mean, because that is really the basis of what our listeners want to know. How can we become homeowners? And a lot of it has to do with affordability.
So the bad news is there is not a quick solution on affordability. If the answer is supply, and it takes time to build houses, it's going to take time. This problem has been growing and festering literally for 100 years. And we know when it started. It started in 1922, when the federal government, in its wisdom, decided to promote a model zoning statute to be implemented state by state, municipality by municipality. Now, the federal government isn't responsible for zoning under our Constitution. States are, and localities as creatures of states are therefore also responsible. But the federal government is not responsible for zoning. Yet, in 1922, it got involved in this in a very big way, and the Department of Commerce pushed through, just through the bully pulpit, the zoning throughout much of the United States. That zoning ended up being what we now call exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning says, you can only build X in this zone to the exclusion of everything else. That was a concept that would have been foreign in 1921, before the federal government got involved here. If you wanted to build single-family detached homes and townhouses, small apartment buildings, and accessory dwelling units, cottage complexes, small little complexes of houses, that would have been considered normal. I was actually just yesterday having an interview done in Palisades Park, New Jersey, where I grew up, and where I developed the concept of which we'll get to in a minute of light touch density. And what I was struck once again, I grew up there, is I was walking around with the interviewers, and I pointed out single family detached house. I pointed out a house, a 2-family house right next to it. Across the street was a corner of a main street, not a heavily traveled street, but it wasn't just one of the side streets. And there was a 4-story apartment building, and then next to that was single family houses. That was the norm in the United States. In fact, in 1940, something like 34% of all the people in New England lived in a 2, 3, or 4 unit structure. And triple deckers were the traditional structure type in New England. Those were all made illegal as a result of what the federal government pushed in 1922 and following. And so we're living with that legacy. Why did they do that? Well, this is going to sound crazy today, but it gets right at your question. They wanted to make housing more expensive. Let me repeat that. They wanted to make housing more expensive. Why would they want to make housing more expensive? A very simple reason. If you don't want blacks and ethnic minorities moving into your neighborhood, you make it too expensive. They couldn't just ban them through zoning because the Supreme Court in 1916 said you can't do that. So they had to come up with an economic way of keeping the people they didn't want in these neighborhoods out. And it worked tremendously well. And it's created this economic division that we now have. When the town I grew up in, which actually allowed these other types of housing to be built, unlike most of the United States, the vast majority of the United States. Hence, that was the reason I came up with this term light touch density, studying my hometown. When I was living there, there were people of all economic stripes and types, all living together, all different house sizes, house prices. That doesn't happen anymore. Basically, today we get economically segregated. And the purpose of economic segregation, dating back to 1922, was really racial and ethnic segregation. So it's kind of hard to believe that was the goal. And they didn't have to make it much more expensive. This is when they said, oh, you need a lot size of this. You need a side lot of this, a setback of this. You need a front yard of this. You need a backyard of that. You need a minimum house size of this. When you put all that together, you added cost. You might have increased the cost by 15, 20, 25%. That was enough to put that out of reach of many of the people that they were trying to keep out. And then by the mid 1950s, this exclusionary zoning was combined with another sort of nefarious process, which is known as NIMBYism. We actually know when NIMBYism was born. It was born in San Francisco in about 1956, and someone wanted to build a motel in San Francisco in an area zoned for hotels. They might say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, back in 1956, motels were pretty new. They were not in cities very much. They were called motor hotels, and they were out in the countryside. They hadn't gotten to cities. And so this was something new in 1956. And so the zoning board gets asked to allow the construction, or is it allowable to have a motel in a hotel zone? And they ask their attorney, and the attorney goes, oh, well, hotel is not defined in the ordinance. You get to define it. Well, that opened up a double Pandora's box. Number one, they now had discretion. Discretion is what leads also to vastly more expensive housing when government officials have discretion, because all of a sudden they start saying, boy, 15 feet on a sideline, why not 20 feet? A 15-foot front yard, why not 25 feet? Why not an 8,000? Why not 1 acre lot instead of 5,000 square feet. They start having their opinions drive what's going on. That's called discretion. Secondly, because they were exercising discretion, they had to have a hearing. Well, once you have a hearing, then the public has to be invited and they get to weigh in. And all of a sudden it becomes a vote that based on, who has the most people there. And NIMBYs were very good at having the most people for decades and decades and decades, the most people present. And so over time, people's property rights, the right to build, not nuisances, but just normal housing on a lot that made economic sense, was taken away step by step by step. And so you flash forward to today, and the reason housing is so expensive and is unaffordable is not so much because it costs a lot to build the house. Yes, the price of building has gone up, but the big component is the cost of the land. And the cost of the land that's already been built on. So you take most cities in the country, California, virtually everywhere in California, it's already built up. The land prices in California are on developed, single family homes is out of sight. So we'll take a place like San Jose. So a new home in San Jose gets built for about $3.5 million. Well, the land probably cost about $1 million. And the rest of it is the $2.5 million house. It's a very large, very nice house because you only build very large, very nice homes on $1 million property. But you also have $1 million properties that have the same house that was built in 1950 is still there. It was a starter home in 1950. It's a 1,400 square foot Rambler, and it now sells for $1.3 million. Now, the Rambler is the same Rambler, hasn't been improved. It's just the same old house. It's now 70 plus years old, but it's sitting on a $1 million lot. You only have, if the only thing you can build to the exclusion of everything else is a new home on that property, you have to build a McMansion. That is the only thing that makes economic sense. But if that lot is 7,000 square feet, let's say, you could build easily 4 townhomes on that lot if you had the legal right to do it, which you don't. If you could build 4 townhomes, you'd build, each townhome might be $500,000 for structure. You divide the $1 million into 5 pieces. You now have $200,000 for the lot. You add the $500,000 for the structure. You now have a $700,000 townhome. You have converted what was a $1.3 million home with a lot, old, or a McMansion that was $3.5 million on that $1 million lot. You now have 5 $700,000 townhomes. Well, if you had 5 $700,000 townhomes, we wouldn't be having this conversation about affordability.
No, I just learned a lot.
Ed, is that the idea behind light touch density? Is there more to it than that?
That's basically, we have, we've done a lot of studies, including Palisades Park, Seattle, Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, Charlotte, and many other places. And every place we've looked, we call it a 3-part cycle for success. Part 1 is by right density. Now that can be light touch density, by right light touch density. You can build townhouses. You can say, oh, the lots have to be 1,500 square feet, but you can't say the only thing you can have on that is that 10,000 square foot or 8,000 square foot or even 5,000 square foot lot is a single family detached home. Because as soon as you say that, then as the land prices go up, you then have the scenario that I described. So step 1 is by right density, meaning there is no discretion in issuing the permit to build that house at that density. Number 2 is keep it simple, stupid regulations. By that I mean you can't put poison pills And so, example of a poison pill, Palisades Park, I mentioned that. Palisades Park happened to have an anomaly in their zoning code dating to 1939 when they first adopted their zoning code. They were a little late to the party that the federal government was holding. And so in their zoning code, it said you can build 1 or 2 units on any parcel. It's up to you, your choice. Well, that kind of lay dormant. As I mentioned, there were some 2-family houses dating back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, but they were relatively few and far between. But Palisades Park is literally a mile from the George Washington Bridge, which connects to Manhattan, largest, New York, the largest city in the country by far. And so as land prices went up, all of a sudden the highest and best use of a piece of land that was residential wasn't a single family house, but there was a natural safety valve that was already in place in Palisades Park. You could build a duplex. And starting in the 80s, duplexes started being built to the point that today, more than half of Palisades Park, house by house, just not block by block, but just literally house by house, has converted from single family detached. About 60% are now townhouses. You go to Richfield Park, which is the next town over, and they also allow duplexes on every lot, but they require that a duplex have twice as much land as a single family detached. Well, that defeats the whole purpose. The whole purpose of the duplex is to cut the amount of land in half. They say, no. Oh, yeah, you can build a single family out 5,000 feet, but you want a duplex, 10,000 feet. So there are no duplexes in Richfield Park, even though they're legal. That's what I mean by poison pills.
And how does affordability compare between those two cities?
So the example I just gave is in, again, in San Jose. If you were, the houses sell for $1.3 million. And if you build a new single family on it, that may sell for $3.5 million. You could build 5 townhouses, each selling for $600,000 or $700,000. In Palisades Park, you bought houses sell for about $800,000. Really lots, because again, the structures are now 70 to 80 years old, and they're not worth very much relative to the land cost. So the lot may sell for $800,000. The structure may be worth $100,000 of that. You tear down the house, and you now build 2 townhouses, each one of which may sell for $800,000. So you now have $1.6 million of improvements on the same $800,000 lot. Well, that doesn't sound like you've done a lot, except that you just doubled the amount of housing on that parcel. And if you replicate that over and over again, we've calculated that across the United States, if you could, if you had light touch density available broadly across the United States in single family detached neighborhoods, and you went up to whatever the number is, 3, 4, 5 homes per parcel, you would add 8 to 9 million homes over 10 years. That swamps all of the estimates of the housing shortage. Number one. Number two, we know that when you need to add houses in the middle of the market, think of the car market. If you're building cars and you only build Ferraris, and the Ferraris cost $200,000, well, what happens? Well, not very many Ferraris get built because not that many people can afford Ferraris. But secondly, the price of all used cars soars. Why? Well, instead of building 16 million new cars a year, you might only build 1 million Ferraris. Well, those 15 million people that used to buy a new car still want a car. Well, those people are going to be able to bid up the price of the remaining stock of used cars, of which there's 200 million of them in the United States. And the better, newer ones, they're going to then bid up because they're the only cars they can get. They can't afford the $200,000 one, but yeah, they could afford $100,000 for what used to be a $50,000 used car. They can bid it up to $100,000. How do we know that would work that way? Because that's what happened in San Jose. San Jose has bid up the price of those starter homes that are the same 1,400 square feet, built 70 years ago. Those homes are now $1.3 million. Why? Because they don't build very much new. And so the answer is you just have to build more. And if you build in the middle, so back to Palisades Park, if you were to apply that broadly throughout the New York metropolitan area, you'd be adding houses at about, in the case of Palisades Park, the median priced house sells for about $800,000. You'd be adding more houses at around $800,000. Well, the people buying those houses are coming from somewhere. They're either coming from a house they sold somewhere else. Generally, they're called move-up buyers. Move-up buyers, by definition, are moving up from usually a lower-priced home. So they're freeing up maybe a $400,000 home or a $300,000 home or a $500,000 home. Or they could be moving from rentals. And again, they're moving up from a rental that might have rented for $1,000 a month or $1,500 a month. And now they're moving into this house. That's called filtering down. And so that also works in the car example. I said there were 16 million new cars get sold every year. Well, how many cars get sold in a year, though? It's not 16 million. It's probably 50 million. The rest of them are used cars. So used cars are then filtering down. As somebody buys a new car, they're trading in a used car that's still very serviceable, and it doesn't cost as much as the car they're now buying. And that car gets bought by somebody who then trades in. And eventually you get to somebody who doesn't, is getting a car for the first time. But that's called filtering down. And through these policies that the federal government implemented 100 years ago, they, A, destroyed filtering down, and B, they made land extraordinarily scarce. Now, is land actually scarce in the United States? No. We have 120 million single family, 1 to 4, homes in the United States. Over 100 million of those homes. They're on land that economically it would be viable to build every year another 800,000 or 900,000 houses on those properties for the next 50 years. I already mentioned Palisades Park. This has been going on slowly every year for the last 30 to 40 years, and they're still not done. It's a slow process.
So, Ed, can I play devil's advocate for a moment? Because we're in the state of California, and inventory is clearly the issue, right? There's a lack of supply of homes, which is creating the problems. But then I look at California, for example. California, we've got lot splitting now. We've got where you can take a single family lot, you can split it, and you can actually build 2 units on each of those lots. So in theory, four homes on a lot, 6,000 square foot lot, which again, can be crazy in some of these neighborhoods where parking is already an issue, because what we have in a lot of our neighborhoods is we have multi-generational living because housing affordability is low levels. You've got people, multiple generations of family living together. So density in and of itself in that house is, I wouldn't say a problem, but it can be plentiful, which is already putting additional cars on streets and that sort of thing. So how do you solve? And this is getting a way broader scope, but I agree that we need solutions for housing and being able to build different types of properties. But what do you do about the dynamic, like the streets, like, because we're not able to widen streets. We're not able to do things in California where density is already somewhat of an issue.
So I mentioned NIMBYism. Yep. California has a special brand of NIMBYism. Have you heard of banana?
No.
Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So I'm sorry, Jeff, but the answer in California always is, we're different. We can't build because of, and you just went through a litany of things.
Yep.
That's always the answer in California. It's a self-inflicted wound. So until California, yes, California passed SB 9, Senate Bill 9, which you referred to. That's what you can do under Senate Bill 9. We've been studying Senate Bill 9 since it passed. Do you know how many houses have gotten built under Senate Bill 9?
I can't imagine a lot.
Rounds to zero. Not because there isn't market demand, but because they're the poison pills. And those poison pills are done at the local level and they're done at the state level. So the state housing and community development office, we just went through this the other day. We were talking to a community in Orange County and they wanted to implement SB 9. But the hoops they'd have to go through to get recognition by the state authority for anything they're talking about could never be done. You can't get through those hoops. Why? Because California is a top-down approach. In Palisades Park, this happened to be there in just sitting there in 1939. It was passed. Nothing much happened for 50 years. All of a sudden, this provision happens. People go, there's actually a higher and better use for this I can take advantage of. And they started doing that. And by the way, in about early 1990, they said, we have a parking problem. And they put a pause for 1 year in the early 90s. And I think they did a little overkill because Palisades Park, the lots were about 5,000 square feet. They're probably not too different than lots of them in LA. And it was all built up. There weren't any vacant lots. But they said, you have to have 8 parking spots per duplex, 2 two-car garages, and 2 aprons, the driveway aprons, each with 2 spots, for a total of 8 off-street parking. And it already had on-street parking because these were just little narrow streets, as you said. You can't widen the streets. They were already there. They were just side streets. And I was there yesterday, and there were every house had 8 parking places. Every duplex had 8 parking spots, which to my mind is a bit overkill, but it worked. And they put this pause for a year, and then they realized 2 things. A, new construction plummeted during the pause, and B, their revenues plummeted because they weren't getting any building. And so the problem is California, either locally or state, says no to everything. And the key is you have to allow I mentioned the 2 things, and then I haven't gotten to the third thing. The 2 things are by right density. Secondly is keep it simple, stupid regulation, no poison pills. We have found that in every case where that was put in place, those 2 things, you got an unleashing of the swarm of American ingenuity, including in Los Angeles with accessory dwelling units. Jeb, I don't know if you're familiar with accessory dwelling unit success in Los Angeles, but those now account for 37% of the building permits that were issued in 2022 of residential permits, single family, multifamily, were for ADUs in Los Angeles City. Now, when did the state legislature start working on ADUs? Believe it or not, 1986.
Wow.
You heard me correctly, 1986. 30 years it took them to get it straight. Why? Because it was a game of whack-a-mole with the localities. Every time they'd pass a law, the locality would be 1 step ahead of them. And it was like whack-a-mole. Eventually, they whacked all the moles, and eventually Los Angeles came up with the way to connect the pieces. And it was, again, by right and the keep it simple, stupid. That unleashed this swarm of ingenuity. There is no special financing. That's not the issue. There isn't a shortage of labor. That's not the issue. It's just you have to have the other 2 things. Buy right and keep it simple, stupid. You put those 2 things in place. We've done this 8 or 10 times. In every place, you get the swarm. And so I looked up, there's a website called House, I think, or something like that, where you can look up for builders and things. And so I looked for ADUs. I looked for LA. I said I want LA builders just for ADUs. I think I got 1,269 list. So then they were of all types and stripes. You could tell from the names, remodeling. Some were specialized ADUs, some were builders, there were all kinds of different things, but they all were available to work on ADUs. I then looked at our list of 19 largest builders that we track in the country, the 19 national builders. They accounted in 2022 for 41% of all of the housing built in the United States. I think it was something like 35% in LA. They were not on the list. Those 1,200 ADU builders, not one of them was in the 19 largest. That is not their business model of a large builder to build ADUs. That's the swarm that you unleash. And so my challenge for California, and we're going out to California next month. We're going to be in San Francisco. We're going to be in Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego, and be talking about this at convenings that are free. I can send you the link to it. People can register for it. And we're going to be talking about how do you unleash the swarm in California. I know of no top-down way to do it. I know of no way to do it by just throwing money at it. California loves to throw money at things. They just had a report that talked about, I forget, was it 1828? I can't keep track of the numbers of billions of dollars they spent on reducing homelessness, and it's been money down a rat hole largely. They spend $800,000-$900,000 per unit. It's insane. You can't solve the problem of throwing money at it. The only way to solve it is through this three-part sequence. Part one, buy right density. Part two, keep it simple, stupid, which doesn't come naturally in California. And part three, I guarantee if you do part one and two, you will unleash the swarm.
To your point, in terms of the government solutions, we have here in Costa Mesa a community right across from us over here that the government stepped in, financed, and converted a Motel 6 to like 20 units, 25 units. It was over $500,000 a unit. Those are hotel rooms with a kitchenette, $500,000 a piece. That's mind-boggling that's a government solution.
Gosh, I'm very familiar with that. I had a mentor of mine, passed away 3 or 4 years ago, Harvey Vengroff. He pioneered that approach in Florida. I don't want to say nationwide, but I know of no one who was doing this before he did it. And he had a motto, buy what other people don't want. And in Sarasota, Bradenton, people didn't want these old motels. They're 2-story, walk up, outside entrances, no inside corridors, etc. And they were basically turned into prostitution and drug dens and crime scenes. And so he would buy them for $10,000 to $20,000 a door. I forget which it was. Sometimes he'd get extra land. He bought one and it had like 5 acres undeveloped. And he'd buy it for $10,000 or $20,000 a door. It must have been $10,000 a door. And they were exactly, you said, they were not even efficiencies. They were just motel rooms. He'd put in a kitchen. And he'd buy them with the furniture in them, and then he'd rent them with the furniture, eventually replace the furniture, et cetera. And then he'd put about $10,000 in them in terms of put a kitchenette and do some repairs and this and that. And he'd start renting them for $675 a month, which included utilities. It included Wi-Fi. In some cases, they were furnished. He had a pool, et cetera. But he had really strict management. And he would rent to people. They had to have a job. They could be homeless. I actually went and looked at 3 or 4 of the ones he had developed in the Sarasota area. And I talked to the people who had been homeless a week before with their children and living in a van. And they were now living in this efficiency. Was it ideal? No. But I tell people, you can't look at this from a middle upper class perspective. The middle upper class perspective said single room occupancies in San Francisco weren't good enough. Single room occupancies in New York and Chicago and you name it, Los Angeles, weren't good enough. So they outlawed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of single room occupancy units and hotels that were present in the first half of the 20th century. They just outlawed them. They weren't good enough. So what did they replace them with? They replaced them with homeless people camping on the streets. Well, wait a minute. I'd rather be in the worst single room occupancy in the world than living on the street.
Before we transition to the big government solution, that one being what Biden is proposing if he's reelected, California here is focused. We talked about ADUs, we talked about SB 9, but the big focus has been forcing cities to build affordable housing. The biggest one we've had in the headlines here is Beverly Hills is being required to build 30,000 affordable housing units before they can do any more remodeling. Do policies like that do anything to benefit potential home buyers, homeowners? It seems like we're focusing on converting more people to renters in cheap, high density rentals versus providing the housing that people want.
Well, Josh, you just put your finger on another big issue. And that issue, combine that with transit-oriented development, which is another big topic. When you do the type of housing that you just described for Beverly Hills, and you do transit-oriented development, it means two things. A, you're going to be building on the most expensive land possible because it's close to transit. Duh. I mean, it's just very expensive land. And what are you going to put on that very expensive land? Mid to high-rise buildings, which is the most expensive building type you can build. Anytime you get above 3 stories, the cost goes up substantially. It's not just elevators and everything else, but you have a whole different building code, and you have a whole different structure set up and how you build it. You're not building stick-built for the most part. And so you're basically building rental units. And so we actually saw this in Seattle, where Seattle protests that they want to promote home ownership, and what they end up doing is promoting rentership. Why? Because they promote the building of small apartments in very expensive places that cost a lot, but given the area median income in a place like Seattle, you charge very high rents, but they still meet the area median income requirements because they're very high. And we found that the average building that I just described in Seattle had 0.8 bedrooms, meaning they were between a 1-bedroom and an efficiency. And on a per bedroom basis, they're very expensive. So that leads you to 2 problems. Problem 1 is, as I already said, the home ownership rate in those units was 5%. So 95% were renters. And there were a few, apparently some condos or something that got built somewhere that were homeowner. Secondly, they're not family friendly. Yes, you can have dual income, no kids. But again, is that who we're trying to build for? We should be building for family owner occupancy. And that's where light touch density comes back in. When you do the light touch density, and again, Seattle did this, and Houston did this, they basically, in Seattle, they rezoned a very, very tiny portion of Seattle into areas they called urban villages. And I want to say it was maybe 3% of the residential single family area got rezoned to these urban villages. There was an explosion of, and they said you can build low-rise multifamily. Now, another term for low-rise multifamily that is maybe more familiar to your listeners would be townhouse. But that's what they called it, is low-rise multifamily. But we would call it townhouse. And 18,000 townhomes got built. They were on 1,400 square foot lots or whatever, because they took 7,000 square foot lots and subdivided them. Houston did the same thing. Houston went from a minimum lot size of something like 5,500 to a minimum lot size of something like 1,500. So you do the math. If you have a lot with 8,000 square feet and you have a minimum lot size of 5,500, you can only build 1 home on that property. But as soon as you have a minimum lot size of 1,500 square feet, you can build 5. Big difference. And that ended up with an explosion. They both were passed in about the mid to late 90s. one in Seattle, the other in Houston, led to an explosion of townhomes being built. And this was an area that was about a 10 square mile area around downtown Houston. Houston's a very big city, as you know, and it was about a 10 square mile area. And they built, again, about 20,000 townhomes. And they're talking about expanding that to other parts of Houston. But small changes like that, again, our studies show, lead to explosions of development. The ADUs in LA, townhomes in Seattle, townhomes in Houston, in Philadelphia. Philadelphia in the year 2000 was probably in the worst straits of any city, large city in the United States. People think of Baltimore and they think of Cleveland, they think of Detroit, but by all the measures we've been able to find and by general consensus from the year 2000, Philadelphia took the prize. They had 270,000 abandoned automobiles in the city they had to get rid of. 270,000.
Wow.
Wow is right. They had more vacant lots and abandoned buildings, residential buildings, than per capita than any other city in the United States out of 35 cities studied.
No.
It was a mess. And they basically put in place, and land was cheap. So they have the opposite problem that California has. Land was dirt cheap, but what didn't make economic sense to build on that land because nobody would pay the price of, even with the free land effectively, pay the price of the new construction. Nobody would want to spend that much on a property with a new building on it in Philadelphia in 2000. So they did something radical. They basically put in place a 10-year property abatement program that had, keep it simple, stupid was the byword, had no dollar limits. It had no income limits. It just was, you build a new structure, residential, you don't pay property taxes on the structure part. You pay it on the land, but not on the structure part for 10 years, zero. And at the end of 10 years, you pay on whatever it's worth then. And it led to an explosion in Philadelphia of new townhouse development. So the light touch density, that by right, was already in place because Philadelphia is a townhouse city. 80% of all the lots in Philadelphia were zoned for townhouses, just that they had thousands and thousands of vacant lots that were zoned for townhouses. So they already had number one in place. By right density townhouses was already in place. They put in a keep it simple, stupid tax abatement. And again, it led to an unleashing of a swarm. Again, the big builders were not involved. Again, I'm not saying that to complain about the big builders. I'm just saying that's not their business model. Yeah. But you can get literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of units just by unleashing the swarm, which people don't realize. They think you have to do big developments. These are done, again, house by house, not even block by block. It's just one lot. It was called the broken tooth syndrome. You had, 3 townhomes, a vacant lot, 2 townhomes, a vacant lot, broken teeth. And they just started filling in the broken teeth.
Josh mentioned housing proposal, right? So we're kind of in the political season at the moment, election year. Different candidates come out, different quote unquote proposals about solutions when it comes to housing. Rarely ever is it building, one of the solutions. In this case, there's a piece of it, but seller credits, buyer credits, tax credits, are these a viable solution for fixing housing at all? And what are your thoughts on the proposal with the building side of that piece?
So let me just summarize it by saying the federal government is very good at goosing demand and very poor at adding supply. So by goosing demand, the federal government's great at providing leverage through FHA, through Fannie Mae, through Freddie Mac. It's great at lowering FHA's premium, which is another way of goosing demand. When you goose demand and you have a constrained supply, Economics 101 has only one answer:
Yep.
higher prices.
Right.
That's it.
No.
The federal government is very good at raising prices. The Federal Reserve is expert at raising prices. Look what they did during the pandemic. They drove interest rates down to 2 3/4. They bought up all of the mortgage-backed securities in sight, trillions of dollars worth, and they drove interest rates down to unheard of levels, and house prices went bonkers. And we started telling the Fed in our monthly briefings in July and August of 2020. Remember, the pandemic starts in March. By July and August, we already can see, because we were getting data that was very timely. We called it real-time data. And we could already see that the month's inventory had already been at record low levels before the pandemic, was dropping further. And every time it dropped, the house price appreciation level went up because there was just too much demand chasing no supply. And they ignored all that until it was too late. And not only did it drive prices up, but they also allowed inflation to get embedded in our economy, which we're still fighting that battle, as we saw yesterday. So the Fed is also, part and parcel of this. And so you can't solve this on the demand side. It has to be solved on the supply side. I've looked at 42 statutes that Congress has passed on multifamily and on community development. And over the last 80-something years, this was as of about 5 years ago. So from 1930-something to whenever, call it 2020. And and every one of them said, it's going to solve this problem or that problem. If only half of them, or a third of them, had solved the problems they said they were going to solve, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
So
None of them solve the problem.
They don't solve the problem, and they often bring unintended consequences with them.
Exactly, the unintended consequence. So they love to say, developers and the government, Congress and the president, love to say, oh, low-income housing tax credits, that's great. That's the only production program that's actually adding any supply. Well, there have been credible studies that, very credible academic studies that have come out that show that what it does is it crowds out the private sector. So for every house, every unit that gets built with LIHTC, a unit doesn't get built somewhere else. So that basically says having site-based subsidies doesn't make any sense because there's only so many sites. And so you want those sites to be used by the private sector. If you want to provide some type of subsidy, then you should be providing some type of rent subsidy that's portable. If you want to do that, then you're not going to be tying it to a site, and let the private sector, build and build. And so that's one thing. We have put together a list of things, of do's and don'ts. And some of the do's are the federal government owns massive amounts of land. And we're not talking about the national parks. They do own massive amounts of land in the national parks. We're not talking about them giving away the national parks. We're just talking about the federal government, particularly out west, owns massive amounts of land. If it would donate to localities a small sliver of that land and require that it be used for housing and that the density per acre be above a certain amount, and that's it, then that would go a long way. There's actually precedent for this. Harry Reid, when he was majority leader back in the 90s, he was a senator from Nevada, and Las Vegas was running out of land. Literally, Las Vegas is surrounded by the federal government, owners.
Yep.
And it was running out of land. And he basically pushed a bill through just for Las Vegas that turned over, I don't know how many acres. They've now run out of that land. They're done. And so they're running into the same problem again. So we think that's, one idea. We don't think it's a good idea for the government to get involved in the zoning efforts, their history in this is really bad, as I've described. But secondly, the federal government has a one-size-fits-all. That may work well for national defense or some other things where you can only have one thing. But in housing, what we're finding, and Jeb, you mentioned it, each place may need to have something a little different. The problem, of course, is with Beverly Hills, back to your example, they've been sitting on their hands for a long time. But at some point you say, wait a minute, you've been telling us to wait, and now it's 50 years, and we're still waiting. What are you going to do that actually is going to do something? So the federal government, again, has this one size fits all. We see it in even the low-income housing tax credit. That money gets distributed per capita based on the population of each state. And so every representative, every senator loves it because they all get to bring home the bacon. And California, has 40 million people, and it gets, 4 times as much as a state with 10 million people. But then California house prices are out of sight. I would just, back to California and its overall solution. Los Angeles has one of the worst homeless problems in the country, as does San Francisco and some others. But just to look at Los Angeles, the homeless rate, the count that's done every January, the point in time, one night count, which we have determined is the best count there is. Is it perfect? No. But is it certainly good enough for policy decisions and thinking? Yes. Its one night homeless rate is 14 times that of Houston.
Wow.
And I can assure you, Houston does not spend $800,000 on new housing units or $400,000 on motels. In fact, I've heard the mayor's special assistant for homeless talk about this a number of times. They don't have any money. Remember, there's no income tax in Houston. There's no income tax in Texas. They basically have to use the market. And so first of all, a lot of housing gets built in Houston. Why? Because they let housing be built. Number one. Number two, they work with the landlords and through something called rapid rehousing. And what they do is they have somebody on the street, they figure out what their situation is, et cetera, what their resources are, what their needs are, and then they try to match them up with some housing. And if it's something where the person needs, the landlord needs $1,500 to make the deal work, they'll put in the $1,500. They may provide a deposit. They may provide the first month's rent, whatever. They'll make it so the person can get in. However, the lease is in the name of the tenant, not in the name of the city. So at the end of the year, the tenant is now responsible. And in fact, they track their 2-year non-recidivism rate, and 90% of the people they place through rapid rehousing are still in private housing at the end of 2 years, which is a phenomenal percentage. And so they do all that more because they don't have the money rather than they do. They also don't build shelter beds. Shelter beds are incredibly expensive. And if you ask somebody who's on the street, what do you want? They will say housing. Do you want a shelter bed? They will say no. So the goal that Houston has is put them into housing. And I'll just say one more thing about Houston. Back in 2013, Houston and broader Houston, it included all the communities around Houston, put this program together because they thought they had a massive homeless problem, which in their minds and with the numbers that were present in 2013, they did have a homeless problem. It makes Of course, Los Angeles is multiples of that. But to somebody from Houston, they really thought this was a mess. And their homeless numbers have collapsed since they put this program in place, to the point where it's now 1/14 of what LA is. So it's not spending money. It's not building $800,000 housing units. It's just doing it the old-fashioned way, which is the three-part step that I mentioned, the sequence. Buy right density, keep it simple, stupid, unleash the swarm. That's it. It's as simple as that.
We appreciate you sharing that with us. This whole concept of light touch density, it's a great concept. It's flexible to local areas, because the problem is it's not pervasive. There are parts of the country that aren't really impacted by housing, but most of the places where people are heavily impacted by affordability, lack of supply. This is a much better solution than most of the solutions that we've seen. So we appreciate you taking the time here. Ed, you've given us almost an hour walking us through this stuff. Maybe after the election season, when we see what happens and what policies get floated out there, we'd love to have you back to comment on that. But we appreciate you taking the time with us today, Ed.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Jeb. Take care. Bye now.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, buy right, borrow smart, build wealth. Adios, amigos.